From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
Thanks for watching No Sooks, No Lefties tonight, this Tuesday. Now, it is important that we watch what politicians do, not what they say, especially when they make key promises at elections. Australians put their trust in our leaders to follow through on what they promise will make their lives better. And this Prime Minister and his government made a very clear promise back in May last year. And that was that while the cost of everything was going up, a Labor government will lower the cost of living. No ifs, no buts, no asterisks, no only for some, not for others. The promise couldn't be clearer. The reality, of course, is that everything has gone up since they made that promise. A promise that is broken every single time you have to pay more for what you used to pay less for. We've been relentless, night after night, week after week, month after month. When everyone else thinks the big political issue is something else, somewhere else, or anything else, we keep talking about it. Because to the millions of people who are asked to hire or fire a government, trust ultimately matters. And the trust when it comes to cost of living comes at a financial cost, but it also comes at a cost of trust. So the Prime Minister, of course, this week woke up to 50-50 in news poll. He thought he could brush it off. But he woke up this morning to the Turnbull Times with a screaming headline. Most voters now disapprove of Anthony Albanese's performance as Prime Minister. And deeper in the same polling today is that now 51%, a majority of Australians, believe that the country is headed in the wrong direction, that we are headed on the wrong track. We also learned today that 50% of Australians feel that they are worse off financially under this government. Why? Because of cost of living. Despite the promise that was made, the promise that has not been kept, we are told day after day, we are gaslighted, we are lied to, as this government pretends that they have done something for the majority of Australians who trusted them with either their first preference or their second preference to become the government of Australia. Now, the reality is that despite the promise of making things cheaper, you know that everything costs more. In no particular order. On this government's watch, petrol has hit record highs. More than $2 a litre, and in fact in the last month, it's been up 19.7%. The government is in a position to bring that price down by reducing the amount of tax that they make off petrol. It would, of course, cost $3 billion to cut it by 25 cents, yet the Treasurer refuses to do it. Yet he says he feels your pain. Yet he says they understand cost of living, that cost of living is the first, second and third priority of the government. Well, if it was, they would have cut petrol tax by now, or they'll definitely cut it tomorrow. But for some arrogant reason, they won't. Then there's electricity bills. Again, while headline inflation overall is about 5 and a bit percent, electricity has gone up by 18% in the past month, according to the monthly inflation statistics which are provided to us by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Not some far right-wing think tank, not somebody who's anti-climate change, but the reality is that despite a promise by 2025, which is fast approaching, of your bills going down by $275 based off what they were in May of 22, the reality is they have gone up and they continue to go up. And of course, this is because of the policies of this government. Now, Australians have always said that they demand more action on climate change, but they've also said that they're not willing to pay for it. But you are paying for it. You're paying for it every month, every quarter, with every bill as we transition from the system that used to work to the one that will make us feel better, but not actually change the weather, because China and the rest of the world produce way more than we do. We produce just 1 and a bit percent of the global CO2 problem. And again, Chris Bowen, knowing that your electricity bills have gone up and up and up and up and up for the full 18 months of this government, he is planning to spend billions, tens of billions of dollars of your money, but you'll never know how much he's spending because he'll do a whole series of private deals with companies to build more reliable, renewable energy. At times, of course, that's a contradiction. And then, of course, there's what's happening right now in our supermarkets. Now, again, the reality of where we sit right now is that bread and cereal is up 9%. That's just in the past month compared to the same time last year. Dairy and related products is up 8%. Food products overall are up the best part of 7%. The only good news is fruit and veg has started to go backwards, but that's after the record highs after the floods. But believe it or not, the federal government also has a say in how expensive things are at the supermarket. From the fruit and veg that thankfully is going down to the stuff that you buy in a packet, or the stuff that may well have been slaughtered just a few weeks earlier. In fact, in the federal budget of this year, something that we noticed, but also many didn't, was a way that they were going to get more revenue to go on top of the surplus that comes as a result of the resources sector and the profit out of the Future Fund, managed by, of course, Peter Costello, to make sure that they can pay for the superannuation of the ever-growing public service. There was, and the ATO confirms this, an increase to the road user charge if you are a heavy vehicle, i.e. one of the many thousands and thousands and thousands of vehicles that move things from warehouses to shops, from farms to warehouses, from those warehouses again to shops. There is nothing in Australia that naturally occurs in a shop. It all has to be moved, and it all has to be moved largely by heavy vehicles. Now, the results of this have been that every single truck is going to have to pay more to stay on the road. As the local paper in and around the Gippsland region in Victoria, they came in and had a look at a very specific example from store transport. Now, what's going to happen starting now is that the user charge will go from 27.2 cents per litre of diesel up to 32.4 cents a litre. It's going up by a significant margin. Now, on the back of the envelope calculation, which was done by the South Gippsland-based transport operator, Stuart Store of Store Transport, he says the 5.2% levy increase costs him an upwards of $40,000 a year. And that's one bloke. One bloke, one company, and the same is over and over again for every single heavy vehicle that you see on the road. That is not the Ukraine war. That is not Israel and Hamas. That is Grim Jim and Albanese searching for more revenue to pump up their federal budget. And of course, the reality is that every single dollar of increased cost in transport has to be paid for by someone. It's paid for by the people who end up loading on the back of the trucks their product, or the stores at which it gets dropped off. And the reality now is that truck drivers are starting to say that it's easier to go on the dole than to actually absorb this heavy vehicle increase. And then there's rent. Because Australia has imported too many people for too long but not built enough houses, the queues for rental properties go around the block. People pay things like $400 for a spare room in someone's house. There's more than 120 people who turn up when there's one rental property available in the beautiful country setting of Ipswich in Queensland. And rent has gone up by more than 7.6%. Now, this happens because of the lack of supply and the demand. This government has made it worse. As you know, they plan to introduce 900,000 people to those very same rental queues. First and most obvious question is, where will they live? But then obviously it's more competition for the little places that are available right now. And even the ABC talk about the uncomfortable truth that when you have more demand for the limited supply of housing, particularly rental accommodation, then the amount that the landlord can charge goes up and up and up. Another example of albonomics, where it's all great for the federal budget, that more people pay more tax and they get a surplus that they get to say at the next election is the reason you should re-elect them. But the reality is that they have made decision after decision after decision, and a greater increase in immigration adds to these problems. And then if you're somebody who's paying off a house. Now, 2/3 of the Australian property market is in a scenario where somebody is a renter or somebody is paying off a mortgage. Now, it's more likely than not that somebody who is in a rental property that somebody is trying to pay off with a mortgage, let alone the third of people who live in the house that they are currently trying to pay off. And there have been 12, count them, 12 interest rate rises since Labor came to power. Remember when it was just one before the last election, the sky was falling and it was the reason to change the government? Well, what do you say after 12? And the reality is that the amount of money that you have to find to pay off a mortgage under this government is massive, on top of what already is the biggest bill that you have to pay each and every month. Now, the average Australian is somewhere between a $500,000 and a $750,000 loan. Under this government, you have to find an extra $1,100 a month for $500,000, almost $2,000 for $750,000, and if you're paying off more than $1 million, then you're paying at least another $2,500 every month. Now, if those numbers seem small and manageable, think about it this way. If you are on a $500,000 loan, since this government came to power, you have to find an extra $13,440 a year to pay off the loan, to not default, to not get booted out of your house. If you're on $750,000 loan, it's an extra $21,000, and it's more than $30,000 the higher you go above $1 million that people are trying to pay back, which of course is a very significant number of people in the suburban areas of Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. Now, all of that has got worse under this government. Yet all they have ever turned around and done is not cut their own spending, not do their own bit to deal with inflation. Instead, the Reserve Bank is the one that has to ratchet it up and up and up and up. Now, thankfully, retail trade figures showed that the retail sector was going back a little bit in the last month, so the automatic case for a rate rise in December may well go into a holding pattern. But the likelihood of it coming in January or February next year, well, certainly February, sorry, they don't meet in January, February or March of next year, well, it starts to become more likely. And that ratcheting up, there's only so much that people can take. There's only so much that people can take without having to sell their house. And then they go into a market where there's more people competing for fewer rental places. So Australians right now are caught between the rock and the hard place. This is 18 months into, halfway through the term of the guy who promised, as clearly as Tony Abbott did to stop the boats, that cost of living would be lower under his administration. A Labor government will lower the cost of living. No ifs, no buts, no asterisks, no maybes, no carry the ones. Now, interestingly today, in the slew of polling that is around that is saying that Australians are starting to have enough of this and that they want action. And not just action for those on a minimum wage, not just action for those that are in a unionised sector, but action on any and all of those things that I have just mentioned that are government policy that make everything worse. These are active choices. And every one of those active choices slowly but surely ratchets up the pain. Well, in this slew of polling that goes from the front page of The Guardian to the front page of The Australian, even pops up every now and then when they're willing to peek their eyes like a horror movie in the Channel 9 newspapers, is a group called Redbridge. Now, Redbridge do endless focus groups where they sit around and talk to so-called undecided voters. Remember, that's self-declared. But they're people who often send messages back through Redbridge in their polling, and they've done a lot of work with the left of centre of politics, and particularly the Teals, about what they like and don't like about governments. And today, in an interview with Laura Jays, in a weekly segment that he does with Laura Jays, one of the people from this company made it very clear that Australians' patience with this government making everything worse while claiming to make things better is almost all run out.
The good news for the Prime Minister is that even still in those outer suburban areas, he kind of ticks the warm box, he ticks the care box, he ticks the empathy box. People feel like, yeah, he does care, he's sort of on their side. The problem is that they're not ticking the competency box, and it's this lack of action that they're seeing. So people are becoming quite disenchanted, quite frustrated. It's now becoming sort of an entrenched characteristic of the Prime Minister that maybe he doesn't have what it's needed, what's required to lead us through this really complex economic environment. People recognise it's complex economic environment. So, sort of in the same way, leading into 2022 election, we talked about how that sort of lack of empathy, the other side of the equation on Morrison had become entrenched as a characteristic of his. This competency thing is really at risk now of becoming an entrenched characteristic of Anthony Albanese and this government.
Now, of course, it's not just economic competence that they are lacking on, it's national security, it's energy, take your pick. Now, of course, in part, the messages that are being sent by many of those in the media are secretly hoping, fingers crossed, that it'll all turn around and that the Prime Minister will be able to be freshly re-elected with his own majority 18 months from now. But very interestingly, again, same bloke, same conversation with Laura this morning here on Sky News, made it very clear that the Prime Minister may think he has forever to turn this around, but this bloke doesn't think there's much past Christmas.
But if they don't come out the other side of Christmas swinging pretty hard on the economy, on cost of living, on job security, that's starting to worry people now as this economic crisis sort of bites, on housing, then I think, if by mid next year we're still having this conversation, I think it's all over.
Well, we'll note that down. And the date is 28th of November.
Now, the idea that the political fortunes of a first-term government could be done by the middle of next year is, obviously, as full-on as a prediction can get. I won't make that prediction. Instead, the most likely outcome is that under the caucus rules that mean there can be no change to the leader, and there will be no change to the leader, then the scenario will be, because the government doesn't have the thumping majority that, say, the Rudd government had after 2007, which was blown away by Julia Gillard. It doesn't have the margin that Tony Abbott had that was blown away by Malcolm Turnbull. It doesn't have the backbench that John Howard had that was eaten away, of course, by Kim Beazley in the GST election of 1998. The reality is that a government that has less than 80 seats in the parliament when you need 76 to be the majority, the most likely outcome of the next election is that Anthony Albanese will still be the Prime Minister, but he will have 1.5 hands tied behind his back. You see, if Newspoll is correct, and it is currently 50-50, preferences still work for the existing government to get over the line, particularly because of that block of teal seats that look like they wouldn't be changing hands. But look at the scenario. If Labor loses 5 and the LNP gets 5, it's only 72 seats. He needs to go shopping to the crossbench to form a government. Now, to get to 76 seats to get the mere majority, he would be able to go shopping as far as he can around maybe the leftist parts of the Teals, maybe people like Rebecca Sharkey, who's always said whoever has more seats she ends up going with, maybe the Indi Independent. But again, we're only talking about 1, 2 or 3 here. So that, of course, then unlocks the Greens. And Greens being in charge of the government, well, it'll be a rerun exactly of what happened in 2010. But let me make this very clear. To those who think it's the beginning of the end of Anthony Albanese, again, I'm not going to take that bet, because governments often get a second chance, but not when they make things worse. They can get a second chance through a reshuffle, admitting some mistakes, getting rid of the barnacles off the boat and all the rest of it. But when they keep making decisions that make things worse, from the number of people who come into the country to compete for all of the existing services that aren't good enough, to the extra costs to move things around the country, the inability to understand that a cut in petrol tax would help people, then they end up in a scenario that's going to be very difficult in their potential second term. And spare a thought for the people who are hurting the most at the moment, the cheerleaders in the Canberra media, including, most specifically, the people who were looking forward to getting their daily dumps on Peter Dutton from the Albanese dirt unit, because apparently he was going to be able to find what the ghost was never able to find when he was doing it for a hobby. And specifically, spare a thought for David Crowe, one of the chief political people over there in the Channel 9 newspapers. It was not that long ago when these were the headlines he was writing. Albanese on track for a second term. Today, he wrote, 3 signs of decay in the Albanese government. Now again, away from economics, national security, the people who are in charge of our borders, that's where clueless Claire O'Neill kicks in. And she is, of course, a shocker of a minister, and she's continuing to be a shocker of a minister. Now, again, people inside the Labor Party think that she's a good performer, she's from the right wing, so somehow she'll be able to save the government from itself. Well, of course, that's not the case. Because she, along with Andrew Giles, has made things incredibly difficult for the government when it comes to their handling of the High Court decision that, as you know, released more than 140 people into the community who had been kept in detention because they weren't refugees or they were people who had come out of jail and should have been booted out of the country, but they were playing the system to stay in the country. Now, remember, Claire O'Neill constantly says this after trying to put the back in the horse.
There is one single focus and one single priority that we are using to manage the implications of the High Court's decision, and that is the community safety of the Australian citizens who elect us to this parliament.
So could they please explain why, if community safety is the #1 concern, the absolute focus, how did they let people out of detention without ankle bracelets? How have we got to a scenario where a detainee who was released just doesn't want to wear one, so apparently he doesn't have to wear one? He's uncontactable now, so he is amongst us. Is he one of the people who has been playing the immigration system, or is he someone with a criminal record? I don't know. And then, of course, there's her most recent performances where on this channel she's been saying out of both sides of her mouth, oh, we thought we would win this thing, but it's okay because we had a plan in place. But, of course, the plan was never in place. Instead, the plan, and Andrew Clennell, again, has been banging away on this, and rightly so, that the Labor Party just tried to make the case go away by trying to get rid of the person and shopping this person to our Five Eyes allies, the same people that are involved in the intelligence efforts against China. We're talking about the UK, we're talking about the US, we're talking about New Zealand, we're talking about Canada. And unsurprisingly, none of them were particularly interested in taking this bloke. So his case continued, the government knew that it was happening for months, it blew up in their face, and they are still flat-footed in trying to pretend that they have any answer to this situation. They don't. So on national security and the economy, Australians are starting to run out of patience with people who may well be more compassionate than the last people, may well be more Twitter-friendly, may well be more diverse and modern, but people think they're incompetent because they are. Meantime, of course, more than 6 weeks now since the Voice referendum, and the result ain't changing. It wasn't just no, it was hell no from the Australian people, you know that. But amazingly, there was a bizarre, that's the only way I can say it, study that came out today from the Australian National University that claimed to have spoken to about 4,500 people, and magically it concluded that still the majority of those people were supportive of the Voice. Okay, maybe you need to move the sample size a little further out from the only place in Australia that voted for it, that being the ACT. But amazingly, the same survey and many of the media organisations that were backing the Voice all the way in, regardless of what the polls were telling them month after month after month after month, is that now Australians apparently, in the same survey done by the Australian National University, you know, the one that Julie Bishop runs, that apparently now Australians have no faith in democracy because they didn't get the result that they wanted.
The news was not overly positive in that there was an increase in the proportion of people who were not satisfied with democracy, and that was particularly increase amongst those who ended up voting yes to the referendum.
I'm all for democracy, just as long as they vote the way I want them to. Seriously? The joy of democracy is that you have to accept the result, even the one that you didn't want. Because if you live in any other world, you aren't living in a democracy. As we know, the great damage that we all felt for the past couple of years in and around those COVID lockdowns, and something we focused on particularly and I talked about a lot, was the damage on kids. Now, we have got data after data after data after data after data about the problems that happened by pulling kids out of the normal routine of going to school. Now, I know I'm a couple of days late with this, but there was some great reporting that was done on 60 Minutes on Channel 9 a couple of days ago, where they went and spoke to a collection of kids who, pre-pandemic, were full of life, part of their school communities, but now are so racked with anxieties as a result of what happened a couple of years ago and what state governments did to those kids a couple of years ago, that they now have a thing called school aversion. Now, I know the hard-hearted part of me, like you, says, well, OK, bugger it, get over it, go to school, no options. But the reality is that they were traumatised. And just like any sort of childhood trauma, it ends up coming out in lots of different ways. This was one of the people that they spoke to.
For this Year 10 student from Melbourne, there have been more losses than victories in the daily battle to get to the classroom.
I feel faint and sick and weak, and I get heart racing and shaking and stuff like that. Some of my hardest days, I'd just be having panic attacks all morning, and I couldn't move, or even if I'd get to school in the car, I couldn't get out, or I'd get out and I just felt frozen kind of.
Poor kid. We had a proper royal commission into every decision that was made during COVID to make sure that we never make decisions as devastating as that again. And just before you think that this is some sort of, TikTok kid who's just trying to find a way not to go to school, by her own admission, she used to love going to school before we told her she couldn't.
I used to love school, yeah, a lot. I was very outgoing and did a lot of things before the lockdowns. It wasn't until the lockdowns where we were at home a lot that I started not wanting to go out and getting really anxious about going out.
How much school do you think you've missed in the last 2 years?
Over 50% of school, so a lot.
Just terrible what we did. A full royal commission, one with genuine accountability, not the garbage that's being served up by this government, who has made the absolute choice to let the governments off because it's all just another inquiry into the previous government because they're fighting the last election, as opposed to actually giving voice to the people who were screwed over by the decisions, particularly of state government. And finally, just to lighten the mood, our mate, Nigel Farage, is currently in the UK version of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. He's been paid pretty well, by the way. And he is, speaking to about 10 million people a night, and he's eating all the weird stuff, and he's telling great stories, and he's particularly popular. But of recent times, the lefties who hate him have been having a go at him, among other things, for being seen naked in the shower. But I've got to say, his home in the UK, his home is, of course, GB News, and they're always finding ways to talk about Nigel in the jungle. But I've got to say, I particularly loved this segment because there are two people that I've never heard of, and no disrespect, I'm sure they're way more famous than I will ever be, but they decided to hook into each other very, 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 very hard after another person on television criticised Nigel for his appearance.
Who gives you a right? Oh. I'm speaking, shut up, you've had your say. Now, don't start. And I hope you've done your homework this time, which you didn't last time, and admitted you hadn't.
That Nigel Farage has put himself up to be pilloried. And if he didn't think he was going to get pilloried after everything he did with Brexit, then he should actually have not gone on the programme. And I think your assessment of Lorraine is wrong.
You're entitled to your opinion, aren't you? I mean, let's be honest. Your husband doesn't sound like a gentleman to me, let's be perfectly honest. My husband looks at me after many years of marriage. Well, that's your opinion. You've got him, I haven't.
It's fantastic. They love the host, Patrick Christie's, who, of course, you see with Andrew Bolt going, this is amazing TV. I don't know if I can promise a fight like that, but somebody will be wearing pearls, I promise. Well, it's news to them as well, because we've got no sooks, no lefties straight after the break. Told you no sooks, no lefties, and yes, one of them is wearing pearls, and it is none other than the great Corey Bernardi, of course, my colleague here at Sky News. Oh no, it's Senator Holly Hughes in Canberra for her sins. Lovely to see you, and what
Very
a set they
cheeky.
are, my love. What a set they are.
Oh,
all right,
darling, only for you.
Thank you, thank you. Now, Corey, I want to ask you a rather open-ended question, which is why do you think Albo is falling so fast? We all know that first-term governments have wobbles, but as even the Redbridge people are starting to say, the runway is running out very quickly, because once the perception kicks in that, say, you don't have empathy, as the polls told us about the previous government, or you are incompetent, as the focus groups tell us about this government, you can't undo it. It doesn't matter how much bribing, it doesn't matter how much chatting, it doesn't matter how many slogans you come up with. If they don't think you're up to the job, you're not up to the job.
Yeah, Paul, there's a lot of reasons why, but essentially it comes down to this. I think it's because Anthony Albanese is a phony. He's pretended to be everything that he's not in order to get the job. I don't think he's the sharpest tool in the shed, so that's the first thing. But secondly, he was always of the hard Labor left. He then pretended he was some sort of sensible centrist or some moderate in the Labor Party. That's not true. He did the classic things, lost a lot of weight in order to be more presentable, but it didn't sort of cover up the laziness that's attached to him as a politician. He was more interested in drinking beers and DJing than actually dealing with the hard things. And remember, his mantra was always about smashing Tories, fighting Tories. That's what he wants to do. He's a class warfare animal. And now he's in the top job, and he's made all these promises. He can't deliver on it because his team is incompetent. They're all chosen because of factional hacks or some sort of allegiance to a union. And the country's going backwards. And you know what? He doesn't care. He's on a plane at 30,000 feet. Leaders don't lead from 30,000 feet. They lead from the front, and they front and centre and level with the Australian people. And he's not doing any of those things.
Yeah, Holly, different version of the question to you, though, which is that obviously the general arc of Australian politics is that we fall out of love with the government and then we just start to get frustrated, then we start looking for an alternative, and then they start to commit to the alternative. How important is it that the Liberal Party actually puts forward not just a series of complaints about the country, but some solutions to the problem? Now, again, you're not about to screed them all on telly right now, but the middle class that's in a world of trouble right now, I think it needs to hear, if it came your way sooner rather than later, what are the actual plans to fix it? Because I think otherwise, you get what happened to the Republicans in the midterms, which is, no red wave turns up because all that was on offer was a whole series of reasons why you shouldn't vote for the current mob. At what point does the Liberal Party have to be able to look people in the eye and say, this is what changes if you change the government?
Yeah. And look, I think there's two parts to that question. I mean, when we lost government, it was only 18 months ago. It's not unusual for a political party to go through a period of reflection, but usually that reflection also involves a little bit of disquiet and unsettledness, which we haven't seen since Peter Dutton has taken on the leadership. It's been a very focused and a very united coalition team, and we certainly remain that way. There was a lot of talk earlier in the year that Albanese might go early to an election next year before WA and Queensland had their state elections. I think that's passed. I think he's going to hang on for as long as he can. So we're probably still 18 months away from the next election. So we absolutely agree and are preparing policies that we will take to the Australian people. I accept, and we all accept, that it's not enough to say, look at how bad they are. And in fact, I don't even think we need to say it at the moment. Every Australian is feeling it in their hip pocket, and yet when they look for some leadership, there's none to be found. So Australians are already starting to see the gross incompetence of this government. We will certainly be putting forward over the next 12 to 18 months, so you'll start to see it from next year. We're probably not going to do a big dump on Christmas Eve of policies, we'll probably let everyone have a bit of a break. But from next year, I'm sure you'll start to see our alternative policies rolling out, and you'll see what an alternative competent government will look like under Peter Dutton versus this rabble.
Now, again, I bet the house on the things that Philip Curry at the Financial Review ends up sort of saying, hang on, there might be something in this. And he was right, of course, about COVID inquiries and the states being let off there. He's been right about, again, cost of living observances way before the rest of the gallery was forced to do it by the polls that they then try to turn around and bury within a couple of hours. It has been hilarious, by the way, to watch the Topple Times go from it as the #1 story today to, down the bottom, quick, up the back, no one's going to see it, right, it's over here. Well, OK, good luck. That might be fine with the people who read that thing, but in the rest of the real world, they certainly are living the problems of cost of living. But there was an article that Phil focused on, which was that the Prime Minister was a bit evasive in a question that you would have thought he could have yes or no'd. He was asked a question by a Victorian Liberal whether he could guarantee there'd be no changes to the tax treatment of the family home during his time as Prime Minister. You think this is a yes-no question, right? Well, of course, Albo finds a way to make it each way.
Can the Prime Minister guarantee that there will be no changes to the tax treatment of the family home during his period as Prime Minister?
They've run out of questions, clearly, when they ask about the family home, because that's in the that's in the drawer at the bottom. This is just absurd.
Members on my left.
We regard the family home, as being essential.
Now, Corey, what Philip noticed was there wasn't a no there. Now, obviously, that's not the beginning of a policy, but there's an area of wiggle room that you would have thought a smart, nimble politician would be able to shut down straight away. Instead, there's all the theatrics to keep the backbench happy, assuming that most of the gallery wouldn't pay attention. But one did, and it's a story.
Yeah, I forgive the theatrics. That's a part of the parliament and the pantomime that goes on in question time. But you should have ruled it out right at the end, or he should have ruled it out right at the very end. He said there is no way we're touching this. Not that a family home is essential. The family home is sacrosanct. It is your castle, and you should be free from government interference in it. The problem is it's a massive potential tax revenue. We've seen other governments go after it in the form of, in South Australia, we've got an emergency services levy, which is a de facto land tax on residential real estate in this state. We've got councils that are basing their rates around the value of a family home. So everyone's trying to chip away at something that we hold dear in this country. And I lament the erosion of property rights through taxes. COVID, of course, was a disgrace with what happened with property rights. And it looks like this government is out of ideas, and so they're now looking, how can they get extra money out of the poor punters who have been saving and buying their homes?
Now, interesting one here, Senator, which was the second commissioner in the tax office, so part of the upper echelons, made some interesting comments in the past few days that the suggestion is that there is a significant number of small businesses that are putting off paying their tax because it's a way of propping up their cash flow. I would suggest that it's small businesses trying to find a way to get through the end of the week.
Absolutely, and I think that's more what this is about. And a lot of small businesses, as we know, are doing it increasingly tough. Every single time they turn around, they're hit with red tape, black tape, you name it. They're hit with every green tape, every kind of tape you could imagine. They're being hit by every angle from every level of government that can get at them. And you're right, most businesses are just trying to make it week by week. And the government now is trying to push through all of these IR reforms, and the complexity of them is just next level, and the size of this bill. And it's just going to put in jeopardy more and more small businesses and catch them out. The fines, I think they're proposing, are around $92,000 per breach. Well, that's going to shut up shop for every single one of those small businesses. Yet this is what this government is trying to push through Tony Burke in the final week of sitting, before the committee that's inquiring into it reports.
Yeah, well, again, this is one of those scenarios where, of course, everyone should pay their tax, but the reality of course, small businesses having to do it every 3 months, we get all of the complications that are part of it. Sort of the tax office starting to blow up about this before it is a real problem, when, remember, the government currently is a surplus, which means they have more revenue than even they know how to spend. Seems it's not quite that urgent right now. Corey, your mate Don Farrell, and this is one of these strange things, he'll never criticise Don Farrell, fellow South Australians in lockstep, all the rest of it here. Now, I predicted this. I followed every step of the bouncing ball, that one of the ways that the Labor Party would be able to lock down the support of doormat Dave Pocock was to guarantee that there would be more senators from the ACT. Now, of course, this will mean that if they double from the current 2 to 4, well, that's an opportunity for the Greens, potentially an opportunity for the Libs to be one of the 4, but essentially 3 of the 4 will be of the far left, because that is the voting makeup of the ACT. What would happen in the Northern Territory? Maybe the Greens would end up getting in under a lower quota, but again, that'd still remain 50-50. The ultimate result of all of that, of course, is that you end up, even if the coalition became the government, at some point in time you'd have a hard left bloc that would mean they wouldn't get anything done, wouldn't get anything passed. And on top of that, we see that your mate is thinking about looking at a report to increase the parliament by as many as 50 seats, and they could end up with 200 members of the lower house. Please, please find a way to defend your mate tonight.
All right, let me just say, Paul, you have done him enormous damage by claiming that he's my friend. Let me add to that pain by saying, yes, he is my friend.
Yay!
I like John Farrell. He's the most decent politician there. But look, this is madness. I mean, I read the rationale, and the rationale was something like, it brings us into line with our international, colleagues. And you look around the world and you go, hang on, where has more politicians actually made things better for the punters? I mean, is the UK thriving? Nah. Is America thriving? Nah. Where is the model? Is New Zealand the place to go, or Canada? I mean, why do we need more politicians? I personally, I don't see it, but it is about, in my view, about stacking the Senate
100%.
And gaming the Senate.
100%.
Territories. That's what it is. You got to understand the motivation here, and Labor can dress it up. It's not Don Farrell's fault, of course. He's
No.
Oh, of course not.
No. We're focused on the lipstick and the pig here, all right? So we know what they're doing. All right, thank you very much, guys. Do appreciate it. Quick break. And then after that, some more problems for the Queensland government. The health system is in huge troubles. They've been in charge of it for too long. They need to go, but we need to start talking about some issues involving women having troubles when it comes to the maternity unit. The great John O'Lee, he brings them undone, and he'll join us on the Man Cave next. As we know, Queensland hospitals, they're for Queenslanders, according to the hapless Premier, but the reality is that Queenslanders are now having some difficulty being able to get access to the health funds, to the health system that they are paying for, both with taxes but also in the world of private health. Jonathan Lee is, of course, the investigations man here at Sky News, and he's got some great stories which are going to be rolling out the next few days. He's not in the Man Cave, he's in Brizzy. Tell us, what are we in for, mate?
Well, Paul, thanks very much for having me. The first warning is this just isn't about Queensland or far north Queensland. This is a problem which is coming to all of Australia, especially if you live outside of a capital city. We went up to Cairns, far north Queensland recently, and what they've got there is an enormous issue at the moment where if you want to have a baby privately delivered, you can't have a privately delivered baby in the top 1,000 kilometres now of Queensland. We're talking about an area twice the size of Tasmania. The private hospital in Cairns has wrapped up its private obstetrics unit. That means people are now driving 4 hours south to Townsville. It is an enormous problem. And what we're finding now is with a dwindling number of people able to afford private obstetrics, so women who want to have or choose their own obstetrician and have greater choice when it comes to their baby, those numbers are retracting, and we're being told that possibly within 10 years, it's not fantasy to say that private obstetrics will be the realm of capital cities. Have a quick listen to this.
I think the major cities will be the last bastions of private obstetrics. What you're beginning to see is the beginning of things starting to crumble. And so, of course, regional areas is where you see it first. And then slowly it will come to the cities.
And we have had patients that have left Cairns. They've already left because they say they can't start a family here. They can't have the family begin the way they want to.
The big issue in Cairns, Paul, is that the obstetricians you just heard from there, they want to continue looking after their mothers at the local public hospital. But the public hospital's made it very clear that they're not welcome to do that they have a different philosophical service. They operate with midwives. They bring in a doctor or an obstetrician if there's a problem, and the mums get the midwife who is on duty. They don't get to pick, and this is said to us, who is effectively between their legs. It's a crass or a crude way to put it, but that's as the obstetricians put it to us.
Alas, it is the situation. Yeah.
It's a very, very serious issue. And if you believe in choice, if you believe in the right for a woman and a partner to decide who delivers their baby, this is an issue which you want to hear about, because if it comes to not being able to live in a region because you don't get to make that choice, it's going to be fundamentally wrong for Australia. And we don't want to see only rich people in capital cities able to decide if they can afford private health insurance. What we need to see is private health insurance for women, which is far more affordable, and you shouldn't be getting charged double the cost for obstetrics cover when, for instance, if you do risky sport or you smoke, you don't pay $1 extra, you just get your private health insurance that you want to pick. The argument here is there needs to be greater choice, greater equity, greater fairness for women. It is a fundamental issue which comes to basic human rights, Paul, and I know you're going to be on board.
No, all in, mate, all in. Because apart from anything else, right, Australia does not have, we're not supposed to have a two-tiered system, right? We're not supposed to have a system where your access to healthcare, your access to your choice of healthcare, the professional that's with it is determinant on where you live. Now, we all know that obviously the services in, Rocky or Cairns are going to be slightly different than what you can get in the southeast. But it doesn't mean you don't have the option. But also what this does is it does then create people who would otherwise be in the private system more pressure on a public system, and that has been a problem in places like Queensland.
Absolutely. And look, in the same reason you've got the right to choose a better new car or a better new house, you've also got the right to choose private health insurance should you want it. What we're starting to see, though, is the crumbling of those private services puts greater pressure on the public system. Now, the big question here is the private hospital not offering those private services because there is a shortage of women, or is there more money also to be made by replacing things like knees and hips? There's another philosophical question.
All right, all of it. We start to see it from tomorrow morning. The highlights up at skynews.com.au. Jonathan Lee, we love you, mate. Thank you very much. He's a good boy there. Kicking ass for us in our Brisbane studio and on the news service here each and every day. All right, quick break, back with more. I've got to show you something that was supposed to be a wonderful moment, but it ended up being more painful than it should have been. More in a sec. In the US, they love a bit of halftime entertainment. They really do. And at the basketball, the halftime entertainment is that a member of the crowd, picked at random, would be able to try to hurl a basketball as far as they possibly can. And if they can get it into the net, then they make a lot of money, right? Like sometimes this can be a few thousand, it can be a whole lot more than that. There was a recent attempt for about $50,000. Here's how it went.
Is up to $55,000. Anthony, you ready to take the big shot? This is what I do. This is what you do. Well, let's take down the lights. Everybody, let's cheer on Anthony. Here we go, $55,000. Oh, you had the distance. You had the distance. Anthony, come back, Anthony. Uh-oh.
Now, I have been, of course, officially certified by the Institute of Sport as an unco, so I feel your pain, pal. I really do. If you would like to join us for the next Our Town, which is coming up on December 10, a couple of Sundays' time, please join us in Port Lincoln, beautiful Port Lincoln in regional South Australia. It is going to be the best way for us to end a great trip around the map this year. We'll do it all again next year. But if you'd like to join us, and you can be there Sunday, 10th of December, Our Town at skynews.com.au, Our Town at skynews.com.au. Thanks for watching tonight. Megan Kelly on the show tomorrow night, and the late debate. One of them, whew, you should have seen them before the show. Shouting, just so much shouting. James, you need to calm down.